We know that the Kremlin seized control of it early into their big new offensive that began in February. And we know, too, that weapons and military stores were placed in or near the facility, and that Moscow conducted military activities from in or near the facility. And of course, for a brief period, they were disconnected from the grid, which could have led to a nuclear accident, and that they were under some pressure, although only in the last month or so, from the international community to allow inspections into the plant. And ultimately, they succumbed to that pressure. So that's, I think, a fair summary of what we know.
The Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has been speaking in his daily video address and has been welcoming this visit by the International Atomic Energy Agency to the plant. However, claimed an agreement to allow independent journalists to accompany the delegation was not upheld. What do you make of that?
Well, I don't have full details of what was happening in the talks that led to this breakthrough. But it is true that I think allowing independent journalists in would be something that Ukraine would favor and something that Moscow would fear. So such an outcome is not surprising.
Okay. We've been hearing that inspectors who have managed to make it to the site, despite, as I mentioned, a journey which was delayed by heavy shelling, they now plan to stay on the site permanently, we're hearing. How do you imagine that will work in practice, given Ukrainian staff operating this plant say that they've been held at gunpoint by Russian troops who are using it as a military base?
Well, I would suggest that there is a connection between these two things. It was precisely Moscow's military seizure of the facility and then provocative games in and around the power plant that created a sense of crisis. And Moscow hoped that by creating that sense of crisis, they might persuade Ukraine to offer some concessions, or the West to put pressure on Ukraine to offer concessions in their efforts to subdue Ukraine. That failed, and I believe the Kremlin understood that if something really did go amiss at the site, it would be a huge diplomatic failure for them, as well as, in fact, a material disaster, not just for Ukraine, but for neighboring Russia, and perhaps for other countries in Europe, which would also then bring further opprobrium on Putin for his war against Ukraine. So I think that's why they decided to allow the inspectors to come in after dismissing it for weeks, if not months.
Just on that point, how significant is the site, is this plant for the wider war effort?
Well, they had hoped, again, to use it as a point of coercion to extract concessions. And also, they used it as a site from which they felt they could freely attack Ukrainian forces because the Ukrainians would correctly not want to shoot back in case they might hit the reactor itself. But then when they began to see that, if a disaster somehow happened, with the amount of international attention focused on it, the blame would lie squarely at their feet. And that's, again, why I think we saw them agree to allow the inspectors. But the delay you referred to may well have been planned by Russia in order to have more time to hide what it had been doing in the plant from those inspectors.
Okay. How real do you believe fears of a nuclear accident at the plant now are?
Well, I think the fears are going down because the inspectors are there. So the games that the Kremlin had been playing probably are no longer being played. And that is a good thing. Just as international attention focused on Moscow's blockade on Ukrainian grain shipments, they reached a deal, although only a partial deal. But still, they realized for their own diplomatic position, they had to stop at least partly the provocation. And that's what happened here.
How much can we take from what happens on this site and the wranglings between the Ukrainians, the Russians, and the International Atomic Energy Agency? How much can we take from it to predict what happens next with the war itself?
What you can see is that there are times when the Kremlin realizes that their aggression and provocation in Ukraine could backfire on them. And when that happens, they do the right thing. So at times, you will see negotiations work. But when Kremlin believes that whatever it's doing, no matter how outrageous, crimes against humanity with elements of genocide, that it is not blowing back on their position, they'll continue and negotiations don't succeed. The point is Moscow has to see the harm that it is doing to itself by its aggressive behavior. Then you can make some progress. So far, that's been limited to these important but essentially secondary or tertiary issues. It does not apply to the massive war of war crimes against Ukraine.
What might
Putin
that...
still thinks he's... Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, Putin still thinks he could subdue Ukraine by military means. He could wait out the West. The West will go once again demonstrate fecklessness and allow Ukraine to be left to the tender mercies of a vicious regime in Moscow. But so far, that has failed. Well, I think that the United States and the West could be stronger in pushing back against Moscow's aggression. They've been strong enough to allow Ukraine to stop Putin from winning a military victory.
You mentioned progress, and I wonder what that might look like.
Well, you mean towards an eventual end to Moscow's quasi-genocidal war?
Yeah.
Well, that day will come. It will come when who's ever in charge in the Kremlin, Putin or someone else, recognizes that they cannot establish their domination of Ukraine by coercion. Despite the failure of Moscow's offensive in Kiev and in Chernihiv and Kharkiv during the first phase of the war, and the stalling of their second phase of the war in the east, Putin still thinks he could win with his military. As long as the West provides at least the amount of aid to Ukraine that it's providing today, Moscow will fail. And of course, if we increase that aid, sent more sophisticated weapons, the day of victory would come sooner, and Moscow would then be willing to negotiate a peace which allows Ukraine to exist as a sovereign, secure, and prosperous state. But Moscow is not ready for that right now. So any talk of negotiations coming from Macron or anyone else at this point is seen by Moscow as Western weakness and says to Putin, continue this war.
You mentioned the role of the West, of the international community here. What more would you like to see happen?
What has to happen is the West has to make sure that Moscow does not win in Ukraine. Because Moscow's aim in Ukraine is to control the political life of the country, or failing that, to take enough territory so Ukraine exists only as a rump state. And that would only encourage Putin to pursue additional revisionist policies that would increase his influence in even NATO members like the Baltic states. That's why we have to help Ukraine make sure Putin does not win in Ukraine.
What does that help look like?
That help looks like massive assistance, military and economic. And we are providing that now, although the EU has been derelict in providing the economic assistance that it had promised. And key European states like Germany have been derelict in sending the weapons they promised. But once Putin realizes he cannot subjugate Ukraine, we will have the opportunity to negotiate, and we, meaning Ukraine and Russia with help from the West, to negotiate a fair peace. A peace that, again, respects Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and a peace which will avert a war designed to de-Ukrainianize Ukraine, which is why Holocaust scholars like Eugene Finkel, say that this is a genocidal war.
Back to the plant itself, to Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia power plant. And I wonder what you believe, what difference you believe the prolonged presence of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, at the nuclear plant will actually make.
Well, again, the danger around this plant was maximized by Russian military control, which involved placing military stores, including things that go boom, in or near the facility. You can be sure that that stuff has been removed so the IAEA inspectors would not see it. So the most immediate danger around the plant has been dealt with as a result of the decision to permit the arrival of the inspectors, the actual arrival. And the inspectors, understanding this, are talking about staying there, well, in continuation as long as the war continues.